When we start looking at the smallest things that make up our world, we normally have the habit to narrow things down. And we can narrow things down to particles of physical matter, such as atoms, electrons, protons, and eventually all that breaks down into energy. And energy has a frequency, which surprisingly, all human beings are very good at identifying. We normally hear that time and patience, along with extreme exercise and doing crazy diets like starving yourself, is probably one of the answers to getting optimum health. But what if you can hack into better health without suffering? Today, I want to talk to you about hacking into frequencies and how that can help heal the body, plus put us onto a road to better health. And to do this, I've brought on a show today a biomedical scientist, an engineer, an inventor. He's a professor at the University of North Carolina, holds PhD in bioengineering and biomedical engineering from the University of Michigan. Robert Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Uh, it's lovely to have you. Looking at your credentials, wow, I was so impressed. You've got everything under your belt. So, my question to you is, how did you get into bioengineering anyway? Because you graduated in 1996, is that correct?
That's correct. And just as far as my credentials go, I can assure you that opinions vary. There are definitely some people who disagree with me, right? So as we talk, keep that in mind. Um, but to answer your question, how did I get into biomedical engineering? I started in 1987 as a mechanical engineer. I worked for a little while in the automotive industry, and I thought to myself, I'm not really helping anything here. I'm just making, gaskets for cars. So I went back to graduate school, and I started doing whatever I thought was most interesting and helpful is not quite the right word, but beneficial for people to work on,
Hmm.
right? And so I worked on a master's degree in oceanography, which is when I learned about global climate change, very controversial, but we were talking about it sort of in closed rooms back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I, I nearly finished a master's degree in that. I nearly finished a master's degree in physics. So those are all things that, those are unfinished degrees, right? So you don't list them. But I actually did about four of those, and as I started working on stuff, I started gravitating towards biomedicine because I thought I could do the most useful things in that area.
Hmm.
And I just naturally started taking classes in it, and basically accidentally, before I knew it, I got a master's degree in it.
Was bioengineering a big thing back in the day?
Well, they didn't even know what to call it. And back in the day, nobody could define it. They would say, well, bioengineering, is that making like MRI machines? Or is that developing new viruses? Or is it tissue engineering? Or is it, medical devices to support people, like life support devices? If you go into a hospital now and you say, you want to talk to a biomedical engineer, you're going to talk to a person who's basically a mechanic who keeps like the instruments running in the hospital, make sure the batteries are charged,
Hmm.
stuff like that. So there's still some disagreement as to what biomedical engineering even is as a field, and different universities have defined it differently. Like at some universities, they look at it as a material science spinoff. Others look at it as like a spinoff of electrical engineering. Some look at it as a spinoff of systems physiology. And that's actually my approach, is that it's kind of a combination of systems physiology and mechanical and electrical engineering.
And what kept you busy post 1996? What did you do after graduating? I mean, getting a PhD.
So I actually was a research scientist at University of Michigan at starting in 1996, and then I became a research scientist, a visiting research scientist at MIT and Harvard. They have a program there called HST, Health Sciences and Technology, where you can
Okay.
MD and you can get your MD and PhD in some technical field. So I was on the research staff there, and I had a laboratory at MIT from about 2000 to 2003, and I wrote a lot of grants for DARPA, did a lot of research for DARPA on developing tissues. You know what DARPA is, right? It's a lot of people see it as a sinister
I
government.
would like you to tell our audience, because at this part of the world, Many people won't be much familiarized with it. So just give us
Okay.
a brief
Okay,
explanation.
yeah. So DARPA is actually the agency in the United States that invented, and by funding it, the internet. So
Hmm.
DARPA started, it's short for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the United States. And it started right at the event of Sputnik, where a lot of people in
Okay.
the United States were shocked, and they said, well, how can the Russians be ahead of us in space, space travel, space research? So they formulated this agency. And it doesn't have any sinister um, really underpinnings at this point. It was just the mission of the agency was to never be technologically surprised again, right?
Hmm.
So their whole thing, and they would fund research anywhere outside the United States, inside the United States. There were programs that they funded in China and Russia to do research, but they wanted to be
Oh,
involved,
wow.
see what people were doing. Oh yeah, it's a very little known fact, but it's not like they have their own laboratory or anything like that. What DARPA really is a group of program managers that goes out and finds interesting technologies and tries to develop them. Like the technology I was working on with DARPA was how do you rebuild injured soldiers? How do you make new arms and legs, and take care of head injuries and stuff like that. So they're really pushing primarily to be in the lead on every technological front. So they do things like they invent stealth. So some of what they do are offensive weapons, but
Hmm.
much of what they do is stuff related to medical, health information, all kinds of stuff. And that's where I really started working a lot at MIT and Michigan, sort of together. I'd spent 2 weeks at MIT, 2 weeks at Michigan. So since from 1996 to about 2003, that's what I did, was just basic research in tissue engineering. And at the same time, around 1996, I was doing some consulting for NASA down at Johnson Space Center on PEMF, which is the reason you ended up calling me here or inviting me on your show.
This is the reason. Yeah, I was just about to say this is the reason that I wanted to have a conversation with you about PEMF,
Right.
because that's what caught my attention the most. So, Robert, in the last 2 years, the last 2 or 3 years, I've tried. I normally try my best to keep much distance between myself and most of the electronic devices that I use. And one big reason for that is EMF, or electromagnetic fields, which comes from wireless routers, microwaves, cell phones. And these things, as you know, can harm your biology in many other ways. EMFs can alter DNA, it can change things on a genetic level. And what happens is you don't like your life as much as you do before. And for the longest period of time, I had this confusion about PEMF and EMF. Am I the only one, or do you find more people who confuse these terms
Oh, people do all the
together?
time. Absolutely. That's a totally legitimate question because I actually got involved in PEMF by talking to some friends of mine who are physicists working on the effects of electromagnetic fields on animals and people that live too close to power lines, right? And that's what I
Yep.
was sort of working a little bit on the side with some people in 1994, 1995. I had done some electrophysiology research for my dissertation, 1996. And so, that's what they were doing. And then in 1996, NASA actually asked me to do consulting for them on PEMF. And my response was, well, it's mostly harmful when you start emitting radio waves and stuff into living systems. And I don't really think there's that much benefit to it. And I told them at the time, said, I think it's mostly just like, research and commercial fraud, people just trying to sell you a device that's actually harmful.
Hmm.
Sort of like the snake oils of the 19th century
Yeah.
that were sort of like, strychnine and terrible things like that. Because the people would definitely feel them, right? They would think, if it was a low enough dose not to kill them, people were actually thinking, oh, this is helping me. So, I sort of in my mind, I put PEMF in that same bundle with dangerous things. Um, but trying to be open minded as a scientist, I went ahead and did the experiment. Designed the experiments and the equipment for NASA. In 1996, we did the experiment in 97 and 98. And it turned out that it had very, very positive effects if you used PEMF in the right kind of range. And when you're talking about frequencies, it's really
Yeah.
important that you're thinking about ranges of frequencies. Um,
When we talk about PEMF, just so people get an idea, can you tell us what kind of ranges of hertz frequency are
Yeah,
we
yeah.
talking
I'm
about?
going to do that right now. I'm going to tell you. I actually
Okay.
posted this on YouTube, and you can look up my name, Robert Dennis, EMF and RFI, and you'll find a YouTube video where I have graphics and stuff, and I explain the electromagnetic spectrum to people. But this is where PEMF and like EMI, electromagnetic interference, which is I think harmful, but PEMF, like the clinical version of it, are beneficial. And here's why. This is where frequencies matter. It's like, where are you on the electromagnetic spectrum in terms of frequency? And there are some areas that are pretty much essential for life. I'll go through these in a second. You need electromagnetic energy just to live. Life cannot exist without it, as far as we know. And then there are
Mhm.
other areas that are absolutely damaging to life. And we can go through that spectrum pretty easily. At some frequencies, you have infrared, right? Deep red, red so red that you can't even see it. That's heat. That's warmth. Without warmth, you have nothing but rocky ice balls without anything living.
Mhm.
So you must have that part of the electromagnetic spectrum. You must have radiated heat from a sun in order to have anything other than a frozen rock floating in space. Okay? It's really that simple. And lower frequencies are absolutely essential for signaling within the cell and then along neurons. So frequencies in the range of, a few hertz to a few hundred hertz. That's something that's biologically derived, not from the sun, not from your environment, but biology makes signals in that range so that it can communicate with itself within and between cells. It's just like chemical signaling, right? But you have to have it so that you can have a coordinated system that can be alive. These are things that are really essential, right? And then living systems can then start to use other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum that are more energetic, right? As a general rule, you get higher frequencies, more energy. And to a certain extent, more energy can be good. Like, for example, plants use the more energy of green light mostly to, well, actually blue and red, to photosynthesize, right?
Mhm.
Absolutely essential for animal life. You got to have plants. you know, um,
Yeah.
photosynthesis is one of these things that just is absolutely fundamental to life, and it requires electromagnetic energy in a certain range, what's called the visible spectrum. And then
Mhm.
animals, in at least in four different evolutionary paths, took up that rhodopsin-based chemistry and developed vision. So vision, although not absolutely essential to life, it's very, very useful for living organisms to be able to see things, and that's an electromagnetic thing. So there are, I suppose there's a few other areas where on the electromagnetic spectrum that seem to be very, very helpful or fundamentally essential for life. Then you've got areas that are not so helpful, right? Like cosmic rays and
X-rays.
X-rays, exactly. Gamma rays. That's all stuff that you ought to stay away from. And then there's stuff in the transition zone, like, for example, certain parts of the ultraviolet spectrum, right? Some of them allow you to actually use that high level of energy to make vitamin D, which is good for you. Too
Mhm.
much of it, of the same radiation, will kill you. So what you really have with a lot of radiation is what's called radiation hormesis, right? Which hormesis is the effect where a little bit of something is beneficial, like a little bit of stress allows you to exercise. But
Mhm.
if somebody drops like a minivan on you, that's no longer exercise, right? That's too much stress. And it's not beneficial to you. So a little bit of stress of the right kind can be beneficial. And this is what's true for electromagnetism. So starting kind of with a realization of that in the late 90s, early 2000s, my goal was to say, can I reduce the energy of PEMF to the absolute minimum so that you get just the benefit and none of the harm? And that's what I've been doing for 20, 23, or 24 years.
And for those of you who are listening and they're trying to wrap your heads around it, what Dennis is trying to say is that there are some things in life, some things which have a very high energy frequencies, things like X ray, which can go up to a quintillion And yeah, that's a number, like a big number,
That's a real
up to that range. And then you have other things like your cell phones and wireless routers and microwaves, which are somewhere around the 10 billion hertz, I guess.
yeah.
And these, they have different functions. So like if they're ionizing, like the X-ray, they have enough energy to break electrons or atoms, which then charges them, and that's how they affect your cells
Mhm.
over a long period of time. And with PEMF, what caught my attention the most was that it's a non-invasive way to help deal with so many things. Like PEMF in some research has shown to help with injuries, chronic pain, even mental issues like depression,
Mhm.
things like diabetes, because it's on such a low frequency,
Mhm.
like somewhere between 5 to 30 hertz, I believe.
Well, there are some patented and even FDA approved forms of PEMF that are higher frequency, but their effectiveness is really questionable. They're like maybe 20% effective, and if they work, they give you maybe a 20% benefit. But you find that, and then there's some in the 1,000 hertz range that are patented, and they're a little bit more effective and a little bit less harmful. But if you get down into the range of about 5 hertz to about 100 hertz, maybe that's really low
Mhm.
frequency for electromagnetism. Um, that works really well, but that seems to work really well. I mean, you would not believe the numbers that I see when I do research. I mean, in terms of reducing pain, about 93.5% of people, if you not about 93% of people with really severe crippling chronic pain can see almost complete relief, you know, within a couple of weeks of using very low frequency PEMF if it's designed correctly. So this brings you into the kind of complicated. This is sort of like electrical engineering and physics that people don't easily understand. They can say the word frequency, right? And it sounds pretty technical. And a lot of PEMF marketers will use that word to try to make it sound to you like they know something, but many of them don't really know anything technical. But the real frequency that you want to look at for PEMF is not how many pulses per second, right? That's
Yeah.
useful. So the number of pulses per second needs to be in the range of somewhere between maybe 3 or 4. You can go a little below 5, 3 or 4 up to 100. You need to be in that range.
Mhm.
But then the real frequency you need to look for is how quickly the electromagnetic field changes for each pulse. So it has to change really, really fast and then go back down to zero really, really fast. And then 99% of the time it's turned off. It's not even on. So you get a little pulse, like a little pip, and then nothing. And then a little pip, and then nothing, because it has to happen really fast. And the reason for that is if you, and I've posted this hundreds of times, and if you want to check me and do the math on everything, you can. But basically, if you do the calculus, okay, if you're willing to do the calculus,
Mhm.
when you look at these really sharp, narrow pulses that are coming at 5 to 100 pulses per second, if you take the slope of that pulse, how quickly it's turning on and turning off, you can actually take the derivative of that, and it will tell you how much electrical energy you're putting into the cells and tissues. It's called induction. It's been known for
Okay.
20 years, right?
Mhm.
So with that rate is the real frequency you're looking for, and that's what I discovered working with NASA. Is that there's and NASA, and then a bunch of experiments I've done since then. There's actually a rate for the rise and fall of the electromagnetism that directly affects cells using the same mechanism that cells communicate with, right? So that
And that is.
yeah, it's that essential low frequency electronic electrochemical communication that cells use.
Okay.
You can actually go in there, and it's not that you have to depolarize neurons. That's not really the seat of the communication. It seems to be something going on with the membranes of all cells, like the membranes, the cell membranes, and the organelles of all cells. And this is where we start to step into the zone of the unknown. It's really not well described yet
Mhm.
exactly how that mechanism works. It's called transduction. How do we transduce? How do we change? Transduce is like a Latin construct that comes from carry across, like you carry something across a bridge. So how do you carry across the electromagnetic energy into some biological effect? at the cellular level. And while we know quite a bit about that, we don't really know how PEMF is sending a signal to cells that's really beneficial. And here's the thing: most PEMF products really do seem to help people. They really do. But the real truth is nobody knows exactly why. And that's really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, you know.
What are your theories on why,
Oh
since
yeah,
you've been doing this for a very long time?
I'm happy to hypothesize as long as everybody realizes.
Yeah, let's listen to some
I'm just taking an
hypothesis.
educated guess, right? So there are these things called G proteins, and there's
Hmm.
like hundreds of them that cross the cell membrane, and they're known to be involved in signaling. And there are many of them that are known to be electrically sensitive, and
Hmm.
they don't know how they work. And I think this is basically one way that they work is if they see the the microcurrent that is generated by an electric pulse that's changing at the right rate, it will
Hmm.
actually activate this transmembrane protein and cause a signal to be propagated in the cell. And when that happens, if you're activating the right the right receptors, you can do things like turn on and turn off inflammation, and you can do other kinds of things signaling wise. So the energy that we're using is very very low, as you pointed out correctly. At the very high end, you get ionizing radiation, and then I think just below that, you can get a lot of noise and confusing information. We're talking about like wireless routers and stuff that's not really ionizing, right? So it's a lot of
Hmm.
gibberish. So imagine you're trying to have a phone call between you and somebody else. And it's kind of an important call, right? It might be life or death, but there's a huge amount of noise in the background. I think that's how some electromagnetism interferes with cell function, by simply scrambling the communications of the cells. Okay. But if you have your PMF down at the very low level, then cells know how to transduce and interpret those kinds of signals. And so
Hmm.
my idea, and this was kind of the thing that kind of was the breakthrough idea for me, was at my lab, excuse me, at MIT. I was doing some experiments on cell development, and I was able to, cell and tissue development. And it occurred to me that, this was a combination between experiments at Michigan and MIT, because I was working with a lot of people. It's not like I was doing this by myself, because it's very complicated. But the question is, what kinds of signals are sent to a developing fetus, a developing embryo? What kinds of electromagnetic signals are sent? And it turns out those signals are really, really essential for the development of the musculoskeletal system, for all systems in the body. But in particular, if you don't have the right signals being sent, you can't develop muscles and bones properly, right? So what I did then was I did the calculus to try to say, okay, if I'm putting in a pulse, how does that pulse transform using calculus, which actually is just a simple derivative, um, into the type of signal that a developing vertebrate would use for developing its musculoskeletal system. And that's actually the type of PEMF that I have found is most effective, in getting cells and tissues to regenerate, to heal themselves, to reduce inflammation. It's exactly based upon a calculus transformation that transforms the PEMF signal into the kind of signals that your body would use for developing and maintaining the musculoskeletal system. That's exactly what it is. And it doesn't surprise me that if you generate that signal again and you feed it back into the body again at a later point in life, it's going to interpret the signal the same way, and it's going to enhance.
That is very interesting.
I think that's a really, I feel really comfortable about that hypothesis. Even if it's wrong, that's okay because we can prove it wrong. But, it makes a lot of sense to me, right? It's like a fundamental signal generated in vertebrates, maybe all animals, but certainly mammals. Okay, that sends the signal like, hey, I'm a functioning musculoskeletal system, and I need to set my cells and tissues in the direction of growth and development. And I think if you apply PEMF correctly, that's the result. The cells will start to act that way. And I think as we get older, we get less and less sensitive to that internal signal, and we start to develop these age-related inflammatory,
Diseases.
degenerative and inflammatory diseases. There's about 300 of them, right? And I think it largely comes down to becoming increasingly insensitive to this signal of growth and development. So I think that all organisms at any age, they have this balance between, okay, do we configure the system to be one of growth and development or one of degeneration and
Typically between anabolism and catabolism.
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that the electrical signaling that we is known physiologically has something to do with this, right? And you
Yeah.
can see it anecdotally. It's like the more you exercise, the more you move, the more you're generating these signals, and the healthier your body is. So, why is it that your brain and your liver should be more healthy if you lift weights? Well, part of it is that these kinds of signals affect more than just bones and muscles. They affect also tendons and ligaments, but also your skin and your major organ systems, right? So
Yeah, it's a complete systems biology, as you said.
that's what it is.
It affects everything. And I figured out a very simple hypothesis, not even a hypothesis, a way on how things work. And I want you to check it out and tell me if I'm right.
Sure.
So I look at it as, like, let's say a new cell phone, like the iPhone or the Samsung, which has this way of wireless charging, right? And the wireless power transfer that happens also happens through like an induction system where you put your phone on a mat or you put your phone on a ring, and then the electromagnetic field that's produced by the mat excites different electrons in the battery, and it'll make them go around spinning in whichever direction, and it recharges the battery from inside. And
Yeah,
then PEMF is pretty similar, but it works by charging the cell and specifically the mitochondria. And it is this the way the electrons spin inside the cell then gives it its transmembrane potential or energy. Would that be correct? Would
well, people
are the
people have
yeah are
discussed exactly that for a long time, right? Well, for several years anyway, 3 or 4 years, people have been talking about charging mitochondria and everything, and the answer is I don't know. It might. That the cell membrane potential is pretty tightly controlled by cells, unless you're got a pathologic problem that that causes it to be different. But I think it's kind of like a little bit like works the other way around. Okay, I think it's that if a cell starts to get the signals that it's healthy and developing, then it will tend to naturally charge and maintain its membrane potentials and its mitochondria, all of its organelles, you know,
Mhm.
all of its organelles. So I think it's the overall state of the cell that defines how well these things are charged and maintained, and not necessarily the other way around. Um, it's like it's like anything else. If you maintain it well overall, the individual parts seem to be maintained better. Like this is true for a car. It's certainly true for your body. If you're generally doing overall maintenance, that's good. Then all the individual parts will benefit. So what I'm thinking is that the energy that's transferred from PEMF to a cell, and this is just my feeling about it, having studied it for over 20 years. I certainly could be wrong. I certainly have been wrong a lot about PEMF. But the way I see it is that what's being transferred is largely information and not energy in the sense of like charging a battery. It's more like
Mhm.
energy in the sense of memory in a computer. It's information, right?
And does that information allow for the cells to themselves generate like ATP, adenosine triphosphate?
Absolutely. If you're sending the right information, right, then cells can activate certain pathways and deactivate other pathways. If a cell is in a mode of growth, it's going to be systematically activating pathways that relate to growth. And if a cell is systematically in a pathway of apoptosis, right, it's going to
Mhm.
systematically activate pathways of decay. And it's not necessarily that activating those pathways directly makes the cell apoptotic or growth oriented. It's that the cell being growth oriented or apoptotic activates those pathways. It's kind of like, which comes first. And I'm sure it's not quite as simple as one or the other, but coming first. But my sense is that if you send the right signal, the right information to a cell, even when it's dying, you can say, hey,
Mhm.
you're not really dying. You need to start acting like you're alive and you're healthy. then the cell can actually reverse a lot of those self-destructive processes, and vice versa. So I think the signaling is much more subtle, and I'll tell you why I think this is true. I have one piece of data that really is compelling to me. A lot of people were having to pump huge amounts of energy into a person. Around the late 1990s and early 2000s, people started building these ever increasingly powerful PEMF systems, right? Because they
Hmm.
were trying to charge the cells. They were trying to push energy into the cells, thinking that the more energy they can store, the better. But what I did was just the opposite. I kept saying, well, how much of this energy can I take out that's superfluous, but still get the biological benefits? And the answer so far has been that I can remove 99.8% of the total energy, but I can retain the signal, right? And a signal does require energy, so you can't completely separate those two things. Information does cross over with energy at some level, but what I'm saying is the important component was the information. It was not the total energy. And with 99.8% of the energy removed, I can actually get better biological effects because then I'm sending a clearer signal without excess damaging energy being pumped into the cells. So I think that, based on my experiments and based on my research and based on the theories that I'm trying to develop, and once again, I could be wrong, I don't think it's a matter of charging batteries. I think it's a matter of putting the right information into the cell.
What other things are needed so that this information is well received? Like in all my research, when been trying to like look at cellular energy systems and mitochondria and things like this, one of the most important things that's I've come across is ions such as electrolytes and things like that. Do you think having a proper electrical balance between the cell is also important as you're passing PEMF through it?
Well, I do think so. This is a question of substrates too, right? Like all the PEMF in the world is not going to help you if you don't have access to water, right? So you
Hmm.
have to.
Yeah.
I mean, you can take it to the extreme, and you can say, well, PEMF is not a magical cure-all, but it works in concert with other substrates. So if you switch a cell from decay into a mode of growth and development, then its metabolic demands will have changed, and they will in fact be considerably higher. I mean, I think that's pretty well agreed upon. And so maybe your consumption of certain substrates, especially things I would think like vitamin D and K2, things related to the use of amino acids, right? You know,
Mhm.
building protein, these sorts of things. The PEMF gives the cell, I think, the right kinds of positive growth signals, but then you have to have the right substrates just to make it happen. It doesn't happen magically without them.
So let's talk to our listeners about some of those substrates. You mentioned amino acids. Um, what else?
Well,
This is just so whoever is listening to this can kind of have an idea that what is it really required by the cell before they can think of any treatments or like think of contacting their doctor and going for an EMF. Because what I like to tell people is that you have to start with the basics first and just understand more about your body, about your cells, about the biology, and just take some basic steps, and then half of your problem is going to be healed like that. Because you can't expect to have like burgers all day and then think of just going to a place and start healing. You need to prepare the body for that. Like you mentioned, hydration, amino acids. What are some of the other basic things that the listeners can take away from today's conversation
well,
that they can focus on?
I would make it a general statement that depending on the type of tissue that you're trying to strengthen or regenerate, right, or recover,
Hmm.
would give you some guidance as to the type of nutrients you need. Like if you've got a head injury and you're trying to reduce, like a TBI or concussion, and you're trying to reduce inflammation and promote regrowth and regeneration, I'd be looking at things like omega 3, right? I'd be
Hmm.
looking at things like,
Because of the anti-inflammatory effects of omega
yeah,
3
you've got the
and the disbalance of currently what the world is going through of omega 6 to omega 3 ratios.
Right, right, exactly. And but then again, on the other hand, if you're looking at skin regeneration, you might be looking at things that are more, related to generating, carinaceous tissues. And if you're talking about like a major bone loss and major bone regeneration, then maybe you're talking about calcium utilization, storage, and mobilization. So D3, K2, magnesium, as well as enough calcium. Although most people, I think, nowadays have enough of that. So yeah, you want to really.
I think people these days are overstocking up on calcium
I
and
agree.
not paying attention to the other most important things, which are, as you mentioned, vitamin D, K2, and magnesium,
Yeah.
all of which have an interplay that can help each other.
Right, those seem to work together really well. And I guess my point is, as we understand how those substrates help regenerate different tissue systems, right? That's where I would look. I would look for, oh well, this is known to or really thought to be helpful for regenerating this kind of tissue. Then you add that to PEMF, and one of the things that I've found in surveying hundreds of clinicians about this is that PEMF makes almost any other intervention, mainstream medicine, surgeries, all the way to alternative interventions. It makes every intervention work better. And then the question is, well, how much better, right? And almost uniformly, I can talk to almost any doctor with a lot of experience using PEMF, and they'll tell you that it makes like nutritional interventions, exercise interventions, even some of these severe radiological cancer treatments, tendon repair surgeries. It Everything across the spectrum seems to work about 2 to 3 times better.
Yeah, think about it. We have like 70 trillion cells, and like if those cells can get a little bit of boost.
Well, this is the thing. If you're kind of suppressing the negative responses, like let's talk about those. Right,
Mhm.
inflammation is the one that everybody's been talking about for about a decade. Um,
Yeah.
it's related to almost every disease of aging, right? Almost 300 of them, and it's the one thing we can't really do too much about. I mean, um, with mainstream medicine, but it makes sense. It makes sense, kind of evolution from an evolutionary standpoint, right? A million years ago, or half a million years ago, humanity's biggest threat was sepsis. Getting a bug in you.
Mhm.
Getting septic. So your body hyper responds to any event that could be seen as a breach of your skin, or some kind of a breach that could lead to sepsis. So these hyper overdone inflammatory responses are evolutionarily beneficial. But now we have these behavioral things. You get a cut, you clean it out. Even if you get a compound
Mhm.
fracture, you can clean that out, and it's not really a major infection threat like it would have been, even 100 years ago. So the body physiologically is responding in a way to the biggest threats that are no longer really the biggest threats, right?
Mhm.
And people are living longer, so this physiologic tuning has started to not be well evolved. I mean, we don't have a long evolutionary history of 80-year-olds. They're
Yeah.
just not, So when we're looking at this, part of the the benefit of PEMF seems to be that it turns off some of these pathological responses, and it simply allows the other responses to injury to be normal. So I would go so far as to say, you know, we can tell almost 100% certainty PEMF works better and better the older you get.
Mhm.
May or may not help you when you're 22, when you're indestructible and everything, but when you're 52, it's immensely helpful. And I think it's really so helpful, not because of what it promotes the body to do necessarily, but also because of the pathologic processes that we've evolved to use, like a very rapid immunological sort of response. Um, with inflammation, it can suppress the pathological part of that. Now, it's never been shown that people get more infections when they use PEMF, but there's a whole pathological overreaction that does cause harm. You know, Even with COVID, what the big hypothesis really is that the older you get, the more of a of an inflammatory response you have, and that's what's
The bigger the cytokine storm.
yeah, the bigger the yeah, exactly. So and it's broader spectrum even than the cytokines that they've been looking at. Like I think bradykinin's the one that was suspected for a while. It's not the typical ones you look at research wise,
Mhm.
but yeah, as you get older, you're more susceptible to these physiologic responses. They're perfectly natural, but they're no longer helpful, right? But there's a very clear effect, and I can say this because I've paid for independent research several times in independent research labs. PEMF applied the way that I've defined it reduces inflammation measurably, and it does so in independent testing laboratories. That it just is. I mean, I have raw data on it. We've repeated it. There's a dose response curve. It's for real. PEMF can reduce inflammation, and when you reduce inflammation, I don't think you need to do too much else to accelerate healing. I think healing at a normal
Mhm.
rate, healing when you're about 22 is sort of the normal rate. But if you're like 50, you no longer get access to that normal rate. Being able to
Yep.
go back to your healing rate when you were in your 20s is literally miraculous if you're 55. But I think that's what happens with PEMF if it's properly applied is it stops a lot of those pathologic responses and allows you to just heal naturally. You see what I'm saying? So it's kind of the
Yeah.
converse of what people are thinking. It's not necessarily that it's energizing and empowering cells. What I think it's largely doing is preventing your cellular response from being harmful. And then just the remaining natural healing responses are, fairly miraculous when you actually look at them.
Also, when you look at it now, more people are living lifestyles which don't allow or actually do allow their bodies to get hyper-inflamed or
Yep.
just go on a constant path of inflammation. So I think in this time, this is probably one of the best interventions that can come over, especially for people who are kind of above 40, 50, 60. Because as you mentioned, right, your body isn't going to do the same things that it would do when you're 30. So in your practice, do you see a lot of, or the kind of data that you see, do you see a lot of people above the age of what, 40, 50, who are stepping up and going to the doctor and telling them like, or ordering one of the PMF machines? Or do you see data in some sports people? Because I know a lot of people in the sports industry, basketball players, football players, they have some evidences of showing that in their locker room they have like these mini PMF devices, and they're kind of biohacking their way to lesser injuries with those.
Well, okay, so let me clear up a couple things. I don't have a practice. I'm not a clinician. I'm
Yeah,
a
yeah.
scientist.
I'm sorry. I just meant that what you see.
I just want to make it clear to the listener. I don't have
Yeah.
a practice, so I don't have patients. I'm not licensed to practice. The other thing is that most PEMF that's commercial, including the ones that I've developed, are not FDA approved because that process can take up to 15 or 20 years. So
Hmm.
it's like many other things. I mean, there are a couple of PEMF devices that are FDA approved, so but they're very very old technology and they don't work very well. That's the irony. The more that you regulate something, the more you focus on FDA approval, the less you focus on the innovation necessary. So people want it
Hmm.
to be safe and effective. That's perfectly reasonable, but the way I as a scientist make it safe and effective is that I do experiments on it and make sure in a controlled environment that it is safe and effective. But the regulatory um, approval does not necessarily make things safe and effective. I can say one word: opioids. Okay,
Hmm.
opioids were approved as safe and effective, and it turns out they're neither. Right. So,
Depends on who you talk to.
it depends on who you talk to. I mean, I've had to use them.
Yeah.
That's how I got off opioids, but they're not effective in the sense of
Hmm.
stopping the source of pain. They can stop you
Yeah.
from being in screaming, like crippling pain acutely. That's where they should be used, but they should not be used as a sort of chronic treatment because we know that that has really bad effects, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, it's like, and there are many physicians now who think that it's like they're not even more effective necessarily than other things you could do, and they're certainly not safe. So FDA approval is important, but it's also misleading. And the PEMF devices that I've developed are, they put less energy into your body than a cell phone, right? but not
Yeah.
supplements aren't safe because they're at the wrong frequency. Well, the frequencies that I'm using are are 8 or 9 orders of magnitude lower, so they're well into the safe range. And if you look at any international standards for safety, it's like by thousands or tens of thousands reduction way into the safe range. Not everybody will agree, but that's that's it's always going to be that way. Everybody's there's always going to be something where someone disagrees. So with all of that said, yeah, there are sports teams that use our devices and other PEMF systems. There's a large orthopedic surgical group that uses our stuff regularly because they say it increases healing speed by a factor of 2 or 3. It's not FDA approved, but the doctors there prescribe it or they recommend it to their patients because it improves the healing rate and the quality of like, for example, tendon and ligament repair by a factor of 2 or 3. And it's like, I think it's over 100 doctors using it. So there's, when doctors use things like that, they're licensed to do that, even if it's not FDA approved. Doctors will use FDA approved stuff off license. A medication may be approved, and for one thing, and they use it for something completely different. So there's a whole spectrum of what different physicians and doctors think is safe and beneficial for their patients. And
Hmm.
I think it's good that some of them can step up and say, well, it's clear that this is safe. It's clear that this is helpful, and that's kind
It's
of
been working for so many people. Yeah.
that's the space that PEMF operates in right now. There's a lot of PEMF devices out there. Like, essentially, if you can buy it on the internet, you're not getting an FDA approved device, basically speaking, because the FDA requires a prescription. So if you can just get on the internet and buy it, doesn't matter what their webpage says, it's basically not FDA approved. So then your question is, are you getting this from some? It's like anything else, like exercise equipment. There are industrial standards for everything, including exercise equipment,
Hmm.
but you don't check those standards to see if something's safe. You go with reputable manufacturers, and those people want to make stuff that's effective and safe, and people are going to buy it, right? So, that's kind of where you are in terms of the regulatory space. PEMF is largely unregulated, and it's my opinion that a lot of people use way too much. But PEMF is so robustly effective, and in my opinion, it's so safe. I mean, you can read 1,000, you can scour the medical literature, and it's very hard to find any negative statement about whether or not PEMF is actually, harmful. There's almost no indication of it. And I can guarantee you, as a researcher, if you could show that it was harmful, there'd be 10,000 papers about it. But you can't, because there's just not repeatable evidence that it's harmful. And yet there's 1,000 papers or more that you can find easily on the internet. It's peer-reviewed scientific papers showing that it's beneficial for all kinds of things, like you said at the beginning, ranging from depression and urinary incontinence to bone and tendon regeneration and healing and pain, chronic pain. So,
I've used one for sleep as well. I remember I was in one of the biohacking conferences and I cannot remember the name of the company, but essentially they had this PMF mat which they let me lie down on for, and they ran a cycle for 15 minutes. And then that cycle, I felt super relaxed. I had some minor muscular pain just from working out, and that seemed to ease up a little bit as well.
well, it's
But
really interesting because I've talked to a lot of people about this, and everybody asks me, will it help? And this is where I think, a guy like you would agree with me on this, that the first things you do are an intelligent intervention on your habits in your environment, right? You exclude blue
mhm.
lights, you make sure you're sleeping in a comfortable place, that you maintain a reasonable circadian rhythm, and that you are eating the right things and you're doing the right things. Then that's where you start, right? But where I don't think you should start is trying to force yourself to sleep, like flipping yourself on and off like a switch. I don't think that that's the right way to do it. But a lot of people try to use PEMF. They want to have a lifestyle where they can go at 110% and eat potato chips and, and have blue light streaming into their bedroom, and then they can flip a switch, get
Oh
8 hours
no,
of sleep, and then get back up again on a Sunday and go back for another 14 hours of work, in a bad
the quick fix.
the quick fix. And I don't think it works. I don't think PEMF lets that. I don't think PEMF forces that to happen. I view PEMF more as a permissive thing that sends the right information to your cells. And then if you're doing mostly everything else reasonably, then it's very helpful. But it doesn't fix it when you have a lot of bad habits, And sleep, I think, is one of those things. And then even if you have taken care of all these other things, I've actually been involved in many conversations where people openly argue about it. Clinicians who know about this, clinicians who have sleep clinics. I've watched them argue about this, and they'll say, "Oh, you have to use alpha waves, or you have to use theta waves, or you have to use delta waves," and they'll get into this argument among themselves, and they'll say, "Well, this one works better, or that one works better," and the answer is, I think it depends on how your brain works. And I think that brainwave entrainment is not well understood. And I think that individual responses vary. And some things that make some people a little bit agitated, other people will find kind of calming, and vice versa. Right. So I think it's sort of like, what kind of music do you like to listen to when you go to sleep? And people vary. I don't think there's any magical single silver bullet for that. But I do think that PEMF can certainly help. I think one of the best sort of demonstrations of this was there was a truck driver I knew. He's well, that was actually two people. One of them was a traveling salesman, one was a truck driver, and they couldn't sleep at all. They just couldn't get sleep, and they used PEMF, and it reduced their pain. And by reducing their pain, they were both able to get excellent sleep. So it's not like it necessarily did anything to their brainwaves. It's just simply allowed
Relax them,
to
put them in a state of relaxation by
that
reducing pain.
by reducing pain, right? So I think everybody's who's struggling with sleep is struggling for their own individual reasons. And to the extent that PEMF can help alleviate those, I think, it's great to use it, right? But I don't think there's one size fits all.
Okay. Your company, Flux Health, also makes a device called the Brain Gauge.
Right,
Can you
brain.
tell us a bit more about it?
Sure, absolutely.
Um,
You want me to tell you something, or do you have specific?
just describe it for me because
Okay.
I found it very interesting. So I just want my
Yeah.
listeners to kind of get an idea that what it is exactly.
It's called a brain gauge, and it's shaped like a computer mouse. So everybody thinks it's a computer mouse, and it should be $14, like a Logitech mouse, but it's not. It's actually a laboratory in the shape of a computer mouse because it allows the computer to talk to your hand. All right, and it stimulates mechanically, just vibrating your skin, but it vibrates your skin in a very precise way, the very precise
Mhm.
frequencies, like better than 1 micron displacement control. So we can tell the difference between, for example, 100 microns, which is a millionth of a meter, versus 101 micron. We can tell the difference between that, and then we use that to send different combinations of signals into the brain, and they invoke different brain functions. Like your brain has all kinds of different functions, like timing, like how long does something take, or what order do things occur in, or how quickly can you change your sensitivity to your environment, your stimulatory environment. There's a number of different ways we can do things by having different amplitudes and different frequencies of stimulus, and then we stimulate two different fingertips, right, on your hand, index and middle finger, and then we sort of have those two talking to each other because they're on adjacent brain points. Okay, we have those two talking to each other on the brain. So what it does is it gives you the equivalent of being able to go in and open up a person's skull and actually stimulate and look at those 2 points on the brain, but you don't have to hurt anybody at all. You can just stimulate directly through their fingertips. And the reason this works is because on your skin, when you look at your skin with relationship to your brain, there is literally a single point to single point correlation between your skin and how it maps onto your brain. Okay, there is no such single point to single point correlation for sight, for hearing, for smell, for any of the other senses. So they don't allow you to do single point stimulation in the brain. But by stimulating a single point on your fingertip, we can stimulate a single point on your brain. And then we can look at how your brain interprets those signals. So that's kind of the science, right? The
Hmm.
upshot is that it allows you to test different functions in your brain that are located in different places, like in your cerebellum, your coordination and timing, versus other sorts of processes that happen in other parts of the brain, and we can tell you whether or not they're working. So or how well they're working, and we can assign a number to it. And we've tested more than 10,000 people now with it, and we have this huge relational database, so that we can take any individual can go ahead and take their test, and we can tell you where you stand with respect to 10,000 other people. Is your brain function in the normal range or not? And very, very subtle effects we can detect. Like we can detect very small injuries to the head. Like, a lot of people don't understand that the definition of a mild traumatic brain injury, the definition of a simple concussion, is that you cannot see it on an MRI. You can't see it. That's the definition of it. You can see there's clinical effects, but you can't visualize them on an image. But you can detect them using the brain gauge, because the brain gauge maps out your brain, not does not anatomically map it out. It maps it out functionally, right? It's looking at
Hmm.
how well the brain is functioning, which is different, right, than how it's mapped out anatomically. Like, if you get a computer virus, right, you can take a picture of the inside of your computer. It's not going to help you,
Hmm.
diagnose that virus. It's a functional problem in your software. It's not an architectural problem in how things are wired in your computer. And that's been the huge mistake that people make, is that they think, oh, if I take a picture of my brain, I can see the injury. No, that's not how it works, especially for mild injuries where there's no lesion. So what you need is a functional measurement of the brain, not an anatomic measurement. And that's what the brain gauge gives you, is a functional quantitative measure of brain function.
The reason why I wanted to bring this up was because when I was looking at your website and I was looking at it, I was really amazed by what all it can do. And especially, I'm glad that you mentioned that it just looks like a computer mouse, because when you look at things like this, it really excites me on how far we have come with technology and how many things are we able to learn by the help of science and technology together to enhance human performance or just to deal with things like, concussions, just telling people how better are they when compared to everyone else. So I found it really exciting and I wanted to share that with the audience. Now, for people who are listening and after our conversation, they decide that they want to try PEMF or more than that, just jump on and buy a small PEMF device. So, how much do these devices cost? I'm
Um,
sure there are
about
so many companies that are doing it, but what do they start with?
well, so this is a good question. When people see the brain gauge, they think it's a computer mouse, and all they need is software. And so people are like, "Well, I just need the software. Sell me the software, and I'll just buy a cheap mouse." And it's not a mouse at all. It's
Hmm.
actually it's an electromechanical laboratory packed into the shape of a mouse. It took us 12 years. The original one of the brain gauge was the size of a refrigerator, and all of that and more is packed into a computer mouse using modern technology. So that's what you're
Technology.
you're
Wow.
not buying a computer mouse. You're buying a laboratory. The reason it's shaped like a mouse is because that's a really good shape for you to hold in your hand and use your fingertips and then connect to a computer. So it looks exactly like a mouse, but it's not. It's about a refrigerator sized laboratory, neurophysiological laboratory that's condensed into a computer mouse, right? Now, that said, the average person looks at a computer mouse and they think, oh, it should be 14 bucks, right? But they look at PEMF, and most people who've looked for it online, especially 10 or 12 years ago or longer, they're thinking, oh, okay, that should cost about 10 or 20 or $50,000. So the expectation when you see a PEMF machine is that it's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars, but it doesn't have to. Those are the highly overpowered ones that are way overpriced. I think that a decent PEMF And my goal was always to reduce it to, you know, under $1,000. And so our current PEMF systems, the portable ones, are all, four to five, $550, $600. And there's a huge amount of technology that gets crunched into that. As we sell more and more of them, the price would probably come down. But then again, look at cell phones. Like smartphones have,
Mhm.
part of it is that they're really hard to build, believe it or not. And, part of it is that, they sell billions of them. But still, the price of a good smartphone is up there. It's a few $100s, right? So the thing is that the brain gauge costs about the same as our portable PEMF. It's about $500. But when we go to medical conferences, people are very interested in the PEMF because, geez, that should cost something like that should cost, $5,000, and here it is for 500. But then, you look at the brain gauge and you go, oh, that's a computer mouse. And they look at the same price tag, $500. They think it's outrageous, right? When in fact,
Mhm.
believe it or not, it's equally as sophisticated as a PEMF device. So, yeah, you're probably there are a couple of PEMF devices out there. I won't name them, but you'll know them when you see them. They're like maybe $200 or less, and those are pretty bad pirated versions, and people tend to give very bad ratings on them. Very bad reviews because they don't work really well. They don't have anybody there who's really doing real science. So when you buy a brain gauge, you're buying about 50, between Mark Tomerdahl, who worked on it for about 35 years, and then I've worked on it for another 15 years. So you're buying, 50 years worth of research that's being condensed down into that, with a lot of, pretty high cost, very super precise technology goes into it. And it looks like, and it sort of feels like a computer mouse, but it's not. Same thing with PEMF. I've been working on this for a long time. And, when I build them, we use only the best components that, we can buy, and we triple check all of them, and we give really good, warranty support and everything like that. And so that's what you're paying for. You're paying for a device that can really be a life changer if you're somebody, especially who has chronic pain. So I get asked about every disease state, right? And you probably know, if you're looking at the Vedic traditions, like the Indian Vedic traditions, they recognize
Mhm.
11,000 different disease states. If you look at mainstream Western medicine, mainstream Western medicine recognizes only about 7,000, maybe 7,500 roughly. But how many diseases can we actually, and this includes broken bones and infections and cancer and everything. So, how many diseases can Western medicine actually treat effectively? And it's less than 500. So, out of more than 7,000, mainstream Western medicine can only treat about 500. And interestingly, if you look at, so people are asking me about all of these things all the time. Can PEMF do this and that and the other thing? And if you think of the fact that Western medicine in its 200 years has only tackled about 500 of them, and it's done some of them pretty poorly, you can start to see the scope of the problem here. But interestingly, PEMF seems to be effective for at least two or 300 different, and this is based on published research, at least two or 300 different problems. And they seem to be largely different from the ones that mainstream medicine can treat. For example, PEMF seems to be very, very good for chronic pain and inflammation. Mainstream Western medicine is not, right? And
Yep.
that's why chronic
At least that's what we've been seeing
that's
for all these years.
and that's why chronic pain is the largest medical condition facing the Western world, right? It's larger in terms of number of people afflicted. Chronic pain is larger than everyone with cancer.
Chronic pain and inflammation.
Yeah, much bigger than cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. You can add them all together and double it, and that's about the number of people who suffer with chronic pain. It's amazing, and it's because Western medicine doesn't accept, doesn't recognize anything that's effective against it. They think that you want to take drugs to block the signal. The assumption there is that your pain signal is just erroneous, and it's okay to just turn it off. But I think that you can test this. You can ask even a child. I asked my 4-year-old daughter. She was in a preschool. I said, if you hear a fire alarm, what's the right thing to do? Do you get up and safely leave the building? Do you do something about it, or do you put in earplugs? right? And even a
Hmm.
child knows when you hear an alarm, you should pay attention to it enough that you do something. And pain is an alarm. It's not just a spurious signal that you want to ignore. And all the evidence that I've ever seen is if you take drugs or do anything else to turn that signal off, then your long term effect is more tissue damage and more disability. And the interesting thing about PEMF, I think the